at Dia Chelsea in New York City, and we're speaking with co-curator Megan Holly Witko about the exhibition Chryssa and New York. Hi Megan, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thank you so much for coming, Melynda.
To start us off, can you just give us a little bit of an overview about the exhibition and what viewers should expect to see when they visit Chryssa in New York?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a survey exhibition of the artist Chryssa's work. It is co-organized by Dia Art Foundation and the Menil Collection in Houston. And we are focusing on roughly the period from 1955 to 1975 when Chryssa is really living and working in New York City at this time. So we are kind of exploring from the first time she arrives in New York all the way through into the late 1960s when she makes the work The Gates of Times Square, which you'll see in the back of this gallery, which is a really pivotal moment both for her personally and also for this exhibition. It's kind of her magnum opus, so something we worked really hard with our partners at the Albright Knox Museum in order to have here. And so the exhibition kind of goes to that moment and also shows some of the work that leads out of it. But you'll see a number of works in different series. Chryssa, in their early years, was just exploring a whole lot of different media, which is really interesting. So in the far gallery, we have kind of her early explorations, her newspaper paintings, the projection series, the Cycladic books we have here. And then in the gallery that we're in here, there is a really lovely selection of her works in neon.
Chryssa was really pushing the boundaries, like in her use of typography, design, and media. Can you talk a little bit about her art making practice in relation to what her contemporaries were doing?
Sure. So I think that's absolutely true. I think she's definitely pushing boundaries in a lot of different media. We know she arrives to New York and really begins living here around 1958. And through a close relationship with Agnes Martin, she's really in contact with the artists working at Coenties Slip at this time. So people like Robert Indiana, Ellsworth Kelly, Eleanor Tawney, Jack Youngerman. And so through her friendship and knowledge of that group, they're all really exploring different strategies for abstraction. And I think Chryssa is exploring abstraction broadly through language and through text and typography, and really coming at that in a lot of different and interesting angles. She's certainly someone who was compared both at that time as well as, kind of in a lot of conversations happening now. There's a lot of interest in her work, looking at Jasper John's work kind of from that same time period as well. But I think if one of the things we're able to do through this show is really to look carefully at her work as well as John's work and to kind of think about the ways in which Chryssa is using language towards illegibility, towards abstraction, and towards kind of a lack of clarity, whereas John's, and certainly artists working more in the pop milieu, are thinking about clarity and about text as a way to convey facts.
The exhibition really illustrates the artwork that we're sitting here, American Noom, if I'm correct. Is
yes,
that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. She was integrating neon into her artwork. Can you discuss how she was really a pioneer in using light in her works?
Yeah, so this piece right here, American Noom, is from 1963. It is part of the collection of the Lowe Museum at the University of Miami, and it is one of these early pivotal transitional works in neon and metal signage fragments that Chryssa's making. So what I kind of understand or take from this is these two sections on the far left, which are spelling out these kind of fragmented words, like the from American Noom you can see in the upper left, as well as air, run, and new. So these are these found metal fragments from signs that she's able to kind of gather through her work with signage fabricators. And so she's taking first the original fragmented forms, and then through work with metal fabricators, having them re-replicated here in these metal, where you can see the words again, and you can see more clearly that the letters that are rotated towards us actually spell out cord. And I think this was fully cafeteria at some point, but we just sort of have cafet. And then all the way over on the right, she's taking these same words and she's forming them, of course, in the neon. And then in the bottom corner, she's kind of taken them and they were almost kind of evacuated to the sides, forming like the frame of the work. So I think it's a really interesting transitional piece. You have the metal, you have the neon, you have these individual letters, and I can see that, or we all can see really, that she's working with them much in the same way that she's working with the individual smaller letters, the plaster letters next door. So yeah, this is a really special piece that, from the various earliest moments of talking about this show, we knew that we wanted to bring it here. We have another piece from the Walker Art Center, Times Square Sky, which is from 1962. And so we know that Chryssa really started using neon in her work in the early 1960s. So many examples of her work are no longer extant, so it's a little hard to say what the exact moment was. But certainly in the early 60s, she, as well as numerous other artists, are kind of thinking about what we can do to expand the boundaries of what the art object can be. And certainly Chryssa, as well as other artists, are coming to electrified light at this time. So certainly Dan Flavin, who's also in Dia's collection. We have one Dan Flavin work here in Chelsea, which is lovely, as well as someone like Francois Morley, Stephen Antonakos, are all kind of coming to electrified light at this moment in the early 1960s. But I think the way in which Chryssa is a little bit different and also a little bit of a pioneer is, instead of thinking of light as maybe a ready-made object, she is coming to it through signage, which this piece is a perfect example of. She is finding these metal signage fragments, which, as it turns out, were kind of being scrapped wholesale at this time. There's a huge shift to plastics in signage at this time. So pieces of metal signage like this were no longer of use to signage fabricators, and so she starts working with signage fabricators and with their neon artisans at that time. And she talks a lot in her writing about the way in which she is working with these craftsmen and the way in which it's, she's pushing them in sort of her artistic direction and they're pushing back in terms of like the physical limitations of the material. So something that she's written, and I think is very true, is that the kind of resulting artworks are this marriage between art and technology. There's one work that's actually directly in front of me here from MoMA, which is called 5 Variations on the Ampersand, and we're so thrilled. I think, honestly, this is probably my favorite piece in this show. But this piece is something that really ties it all together. Of course, it's 5 versions of the ampersand, and we specifically chose the ampersand in Chryssa and New York as opposed to writing out the word. And this is a piece that was shown at Pace in 1966. And in fact, it was 5 separate ampersands that were available for purchase. But Dorothy Miller, noted MoMA curator, who had shown actually this work in 1963 in the American show at MoMA, worked with Dominique and Jean Desmanil to purchase this for MoMA as a set of 5. So it is the only one that exists as a full set of 5, and we're able to have it here. And I think the ampersand for me is the perfect exploration of this idea. You know, as someone, it's really hard for me to look at a letter A and not think of it as a letter A. But an ampersand is just sort of weird enough and different enough that I know conceptually that that means and, but when she's represented it here in these 5 beautiful forms, and the 5th one is actually kind of in absentia, I think that that really best conveys her point of like, what does this symbol actually mean, and why do we associate it with and kind of exploring it as an art object as opposed to that symbol that we know so well.
Kind of playing a little bit over some of the things that you've talked about, and a little bit of this idea of how, like you mentioned, like other pop artists dealing with typography, we're looking for clarity, where she's really moving us away from that kind of clear, being able to understand or read what the text says. To me, I see that her use of language kind of is a bit of a precursor to maybe conceptual art, or ideas associated with semiotics and the theories that kind of come out of that. So can you talk a little bit about her use of typography in her work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think she comes to text and to language as early as 1958 and 1959, which are works in the next gallery. We have some of these projection series, which is she's created letters. We have a T and an F, and instead of painting them on the canvas or as a sculpture, she's created all of these little projected pegs or T-forms that kind of create the shape of the letter projecting off of the canvas. So we know, again, that this is the time that she's first coming to New York City and first kind of making her home here. She first moved to San Francisco in 1955 from Paris, having been in Athens before that. We know from some of the firsthand accounts that she's also learning English at this time and kind of beginning to incorporate that into her life. So I think from that, she is looking at language and text and letters in this very abstract way. And maybe because, you know, she's not a native English speaker, she's able to see letters as not just conveying meaning, not just the immediate that we recognize them, but as elements for abstraction, as tools for art. And so she's taking them and using them as formal elements. So there's a number of works where she's kind of rotating the letters in a two-dimensional way in towards the center, and then she also begins exploring them in a three-dimensional way, which you can also even see here in this work. So when we have a C that's like facing directly at us, what does that even mean? Can we recognize that as a letter? There's a piece in the next gallery called Large Untitled Letters, which I really love because it is this kind of two-dimensional array of letters. And at first it looks, kind of like a random assortment, but the more time you spend with it, you'll see that she's really chosen all of these pointy, sharp letters. There's M's and W's and V's, and it has this very angular, almost arrow-like format to it. So you can see the way she's not recognizing these for any sort of meaning or spelling anything, but rather about their shape and about their formal properties.
One of the other things too, because this is such an in-depth exhibition, of everything that she was doing in New York, was there anything about putting this exhibition together that was particularly challenging? I'm thinking about maybe some conservation or some installation issues that may have arisen because of the type of media that she uses.
Yeah, Chryssa had a huge moment, a lot of prominence in the 1960s. I think about her 1966 show at Pace Gallery, which included the gates for Times Square, as well as several other works in this gallery. It sold out. All of the works went to major museums. Pace was fully booked with Chryssa works at that time. And a lot of those works, as I said, went to major museums, but as she her prominence diminished, she fell out of the public conversation, if you will. These works were naturally, not on display as frequently in museums. They were often in storage. So this exhibition is excitingly a time to bring a lot of those works out to storage and bring them into the public eye for the first time, some case in more than a decade. So that created a challenge where there were neon conservators, museum conservators, working on a number of Chryssa works all at the very same time, which was kind of a unique situation. But we were really fortunate in that one of the conservators at the Menil, Joy Blauser, really led a charge in terms of forming, I would say, a network, a community around that, and so that all of the conservators who were working on these pieces at the same time were in daily contact with each other, I want to say, and really just texting and reaching out and having these conversations about all the work that was happening, which was really a beautiful and for me, coming from the curatorial side, an unexpected angle to it. That was wonderful.
Yeah, that's really great. One of the things that came up when I saw the exhibition and learned about it was how did I not know about this artist before? And it seems like you were just mentioning she was really, really popular and was purchased by a lot of museum collections, but then for 40 years, beginning around the 1980s, we don't really see her work being exhibited a lot. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a number of compounding reasons. I think one of them is what I was alluding to, which is that she worked in many series, many media, just really prolific. But my humble opinion is that the best work is in neon, and I think indeed she's certainly most known for neon, we can say that. So a lot of these works went to museum collections, and when she became less well known, neon is a material is inherently fragile and prone to decay when we're not turning it on regularly, we're not even connecting the power regularly. All of those things lead neon to decay in a way that, say, putting a painting in storage for a decade doesn't have that same impact. So I think then later, as later scholars, later curators are interested in showing the work, I think the fact that there was conservation that needed to happen was a hump that we needed to get over in order to bring her name back into the conversation. She's definitely someone we alluded to earlier who was really at the forefront of a lot of these different movements. And so once her name fell out of circulation, if you will, I think it's an unfortunate byproduct that it took a lot of work to bring that back to fruition.
It's a lot of work, and you've mentioned a lot about collaboration. And so, speaking of, this will be traveling to the Menil Collection in Houston in a few months. And the DIA Foundation and the Menil seem to have a little bit of a history of working together and collaborating. Can you talk about how this Chryssa exhibition ties into that idea of collaboration between the Menil Collection and DIA?
Yeah, absolutely. I should say, in terms of collaboration, to start with my co-curator at the Menil Collection, Michelle White. was incredible, and we could not have done this without her. I certainly couldn't have done it without her. So it's a wonderful collaboration between Dia and the Menil, and I also want to add that we have a third venue, Wrightwood 659 in Chicago, which will be the concluding venue. But Dia and the Menil, as you said, indeed have a really lovely shared history. The founders of Dia in 1974 were Heiner Friedrich and Philippa de Menil, who was the daughter of John and Dominique de Menil, as well as Helen Winknother. So it is kind of wonderful that we have this shared history and sort of shared familial ties, if you will. But I think there's also kind of a shared mission or shared kind of way of thinking about artists and presenting art, in that both Dia and the Menil have a long history of supporting artists for the duration of their career in really impactful ways, and also in presenting art and artwork without a lot of institutional mediation. So you'll see here, as well as at the Menil, there's not a lot of wall text or labels. You're kind of allowed to encounter the work in your own way. So I'd like to think that by devoting the resources that we've kind of been implying throughout this conversation to bringing the work of such an under-recognized artist back to life, Dia and the Menil are kind of continuing that tradition of supporting artists for the long duration.
Find all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.